Hey, good evening. Welcome to Legal Talk, brought to you by your law firm. That is O'Donnell, Weiss and Megay Law Offices. We're at 41 High Street in Pottstown, where we've been actually for 66 years. And we're at 347 Bridge Street in Phoenixville, where we've been for 13 years, I believe. My name's Dave Megay, and I'm an attorney with the office. And tonight, I'm joined by Joe Koury on my left, and on my right, Jim Kovaleski. And Jim and Joe do a lot of the business planning for the office. And folks, tonight, well, we're going to kick off tonight, I should say, a three-part mini-series, which sounds pretty cool, doesn't it, Joe? Three-part mini-series.
A limited mini-series.
There you go. on something called Limited Liability Corporations or Limited Liability Companies. Tonight, we're going to talk for a few minutes about the background behind Limited Liability Companies, otherwise known as LLCs. Good guess, Jim. And then also at another episode, we're going to talk about the how the LLC operates and the pros and cons of an LLC vis-a-vis no LLC, and then an LLC vis-a-vis the other type of corporate entity, which is an S corporation. The other more popular corporate entity. And then finally, the last part of the three-part mini-series, if you will be about tax consequences of LLCs. So guys, let's jump into this for a few minutes here.
Yeah, I think we should add, we're really talking about owning real estate in these various entities.
Yeah, that's a good point, Joe. Let's really focus on owning or forming an LLC for the purpose of owning real estate. Joe, roughly when did LLCs, because I'm an old head, so I remember when we didn't have LLCs in Pennsylvania, if you were going to buy an investment piece of real estate in a corporate entity, you did it in something called an S corporation. But when did LLCs come into play nationally?
Yeah, I think really it wasn't until the 1990s that you started to see various states enact statutes allowing for LLCs.
Mm-hmm.
Wyoming was actually the first state, if you can imagine that, and I believe it was in the late 70s.
Okay, yeah. I remember I started in the mid 80s, Jim, in Pennsylvania, and we didn't have LLCs for probably a good 10 years later. So off the top of my head, I think that LLCs were passed, or the statute was passed in the mid 90s.
I agree with that.
Sounds about right.
That's what I remember.
All right, Jim, tell me about if you bought a rental property, why would you buy it in the name of an LLC corporate entity? What, in a thumbnail sketch, what's some of the background reasons, if you will, for doing so?
Sure. The biggest one, the one that we think of first, is personal liability. If you own a property, rental property, or any other type of property in your personal name, and something happens, someone's hurt on that property, you are potentially personally liable for those damages. So in order to help insulate our clients, we always talk about and recommend the use of an LLC. So in that situation, if there's an issue, the LLC is the responsible party. You personally, in most instances, and I think we're going to get into that a little bit later where that can go wrong, but in most instances, you're going to be protected personally. So that's the big issue, right?
Okay.
From there, we look at things like privacy. Some people don't want to be the face or have their name in the public records as far as owning property for whatever reason. And there's many reasons that could be the case. So we can put it in a corporate entity. That corporate entity is the public face then as the landlord, as the owner of that property.
Okay. Joe, couldn't the owner not do an LLC and avoid the liability that Jim was talking about by buying insurance? Liability insurance.
Yeah, sure. Arguably, you can always insure over a risk, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, there are limits to coverage. There's a cost to insurance, and maybe you only have $100,000 in coverage, and a person slips and falls and has $500,000 worth of
right,
injury.
or more, if worse, if that person gets severely hurt. Also, the liability insurance wouldn't protect that individual landlord from contractual liability to a tenant and a lease,
Right.
or maybe to a vendor or a contractor.
Or maybe there's an exclusion under the insurance policy for whatever reason, so coverage isn't available at all.
Okay.
I think it's important to note, though, Dave, that an LLC or other corporate entity is always a good idea, but I routinely tell clients insurance is going to be your first line of defense regardless.
Right.
Because you don't want to have to expose the assets of the LLC, whatever they may be, at all, if you can avoid it through the use of insurance.
Well, and also, Joe, in the few minutes we have left on this topic, or this first part of the series on LLCs, and I'm sure I know we've talked about this in our blogs on owmlaw.com website, as well as in previous shows, that just forming an LLC or any kind of corporate entity is not in and of itself the end of the day, because there are corporate formalities you must follow. Am I right about that?
That's true. The good news is they're much less with an LLC than other types of entities, such as an S corporation.
Okay,
but,
we'll talk about that in the second part of the series,
Right.
the ease of operations. But,
Right.
but I've had in years past seen where an individual has formed a corporate entity and doesn't really operate as that corporate entity.
Yep.
And there's something called pierce the corporate veil.
Yep, absolutely.
Maybe we can touch on that for a minute here.
Absolutely, and I think what you're alluding to, Dave, is what we've seen. Unfortunately, is an individual goes to buy real estate in their corporate entity. Sometimes that deed gets messed up, and the deed is put in their individual name as opposed to the corporate entity. So that's, if it's never put in there, it's real easy to pierce the corporate veil. But beyond that, assuming the deed gets done correctly, you underfund your LLC. Things like not having the insurance that Joe mentioned. That could be something where the courts will look at and say, you're not really treating this as its own separate entity. You're not treating it legitimately because you didn't fund it. You didn't have it get insurance, which is what a reasonable person would do. Those are issues. Not entering into the lease. So the LLC owns the real estate, but the individual signs their own name and puts the lease in their individual name as opposed to the entity name. Big issues. So these things.
How about not filing a tax return? We'll talk about that in episode 3. Not filing a tax return for that corporate.
Not filing a tax return, or using money from the LLC to pay your personal bills, or using your personal money to pay the LLC bills out of personal bank accounts. Things like that sounds like it's minutia, but it's not. It's really important to do that to protect those corporate formalities.
And Joe, if the individual doesn't follow those corporate formalities that Jim talked about, in a nutshell, or in layman's terms, what does pierce the corporate veil mean?
It means personal assets are at risk because it's as if the entity doesn't exist at all.
Okay, and it's almost like the individual either intentionally or maliciously or perhaps innocently used the corporate shield, and the law doesn't like that person to be able to use a corporate shield to avoid liabilities unless they really are acting as a corporation.
Correct.
Okay, great. Guys, thanks a lot for joining me, and we're going to talk on the second part of this mini-series about the ease of operations of LLCs versus no LLC, and LLCs versus the other type of popular corporate entity, S corporations. Folks, you've been watching Legal Talk, brought to you by O'Donnell, Weiss, and Megay, your law office, your life, your business, your law firm. Thank you.